In 1877, at the outset of what became known as the Satsuma Rebellion, roughly 30,000 men took the field against a modernized national army. Many carried swords. They also carried rifles and artillery. But they were outgunned, outnumbered, and outfunded by a government that had spent a decade building a military they could not match. They lost in 6 months. But military defeat was not what destroyed the samurai class. By the time that campaign began, the destruction was already complete, not on a battlefield, in a ledger. For decades before the first shot was fired, the warrior class of Japan had been quietly bleeding out through debt. Their wealth was measured in rice while the world around them shifted to coin. To survive, they borrowed from merchants, the very class they once looked down upon. Interest accumulated. Status was maintained on credit. And by the time the Meiji government finally stripped away their stipends, many samurai had nothing left to lose because they had already lost it. That is the story worth telling. Not the last battle, but the slow, invisible collapse that made the battle inevitable. Welcome to a channel built on one idea, that economic history is not a footnote to political history, it is the foundation beneath it. The decades leading up to 1877 saw Japan transforming at a pace almost without precedent in the modern world. The Meiji government had abolished the feudal domain system, established a national army, built railways, and opened banks. A new civil service replaced the old hereditary order. Merchants and industrialists were accumulating capital. Western-style institutions were being imported and adapted with deliberate urgency. The samurai class, as a legal and economic category, had ceased to exist. In 1876, the government formalized what had already been unraveling for years. Hereditary stipends were converted into government bonds through a process that played out unevenly across different ranks and domains, and the wearing of swords in public was banned. These were not casual policy decisions. They were the final administrative cuts to a class that had already been economically hollowed out. The Japan that emerged from this period was unrecognizable from the one that had existed just 30 years earlier. Within a single generation, a feudal agricultural economy governed by a warrior aristocracy had become an industrializing state, governed by a centralized bureaucracy. The samurai had not simply lost political power. They had lost their entire material foundation, and the story of how that happened begins much earlier and much more quietly than most accounts suggest. To understand what the samurai lost, you have to understand what they once had, and how fragile it actually was. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, which governed Japan from 1603 to 1868, the samurai occupied the top of a rigid 4-tier social hierarchy. Below them came farmers, then artisans, then merchants. This ordering was not merely symbolic. It was encoded into law, dress, movement, and economic life. Merchants, despite accumulating considerable wealth by the 18th century, occupied the lowest rung of the official hierarchy because they produced nothing, they only traded. The samurai, by contrast, were compensated through a system of rice stipends. Each domain, ruled by a lord called a daimyo, allocated portions of its rice harvest to retain samurai retainers. The size of a stipend was measured in koku, 1 koku being roughly the amount of rice needed to feed one person for a year. A high-ranking samurai might receive hundreds or even thousands of koku annually. Lower-ranking ones received far less, sometimes barely enough to sustain a household. For most of the Tokugawa period, Japan was at peace. The country had closed itself to most foreign trade in the 1630s, and internal conflicts had been largely suppressed. This created a paradox that would define the class for 2 centuries. Samurai were warriors in a society that no longer fought wars. Their administrative and ceremonial roles expanded to fill the vacuum. They served as bureaucrats, tax collectors, and local officials, but their compensation structure never evolved. It remained rooted in a rice economy, while Japan's urban centers, particularly Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, were developing sophisticated cash-based commercial systems. Edo, which would later become Tokyo, had a population of roughly 1 million by the early 18th century, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Cities run on money, not rice, and samurai living in or near these urban centers needed money to pay rent, buy food, hire servants, and maintain the appearance of status that their social position demanded. The gap between what a samurai received and what urban life actually cost was, for many, impossible to close through income alone. The transformation did not happen overnight. It was a slow structural failure that played out across roughly 200 years, accelerating sharply in the final decades of Tokugawa rule. The mechanism was straightforward. Samurai needed cash. Merchants were among the few actors in Tokugawa Japan with the capital and the credit networks to provide it. So samurai borrowed. What followed was a cycle that financial historians have documented across many contexts. A class with status but limited liquidity turns to creditors, uses that credit to maintain its lifestyle, and gradually finds itself transferring real wealth to those creditors through interest payments and asset liquidation. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, many samurai households were chronically indebted to merchant lenders. Some domains were so deeply in debt that their annual rice revenue was effectively spoken for before it was even collected. In several documented cases, daimyo domains owed merchants sums that would have taken decades to repay at full income. The merchants who rose to prominence in this environment, figures like the Mitsui family, who began as dry goods traders in the 17th century and expanded into money exchange and financial services, accumulated real economic power through a combination of factors: their control of urban supply chains, their access to currency markets, and the growing dependence of samurai households on credit. The social hierarchy said merchants were inferior. The balance sheet told a different story. The Tokugawa shogunate was aware of this problem and attempted to address it at several points. During the Kansei reforms of the 1790s, the senior counselor Matsudaira Sadanobu introduced measures aimed at relieving the debt burden of lower-ranking retainers serving the shogunate, applying institutional pressure on creditors to reduce or restructure outstanding obligations. Some households received relief, but the structural gap remained, and the debts returned. In 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Ito Bay with a small fleet of steam-powered warships and demanded that Japan open itself to foreign trade. The arrival of Perry's fleet exposed something that many within the Japanese ruling class had suspected but been reluctant to confront. The country's military technology had stagnated relative to Western powers. The shogunate signed the Convention of Kanagawa in 1854, granting the United States access to the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate. Similar treaties with other Western nations followed. The political crisis triggered by these unequal treaties eventually contributed to the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate and the Meiji Restoration of 1868, in which power was nominally returned to Emperor Meiji and a new government of reform-minded leaders took control. The Meiji government moved quickly to dismantle the structures of the old order. Domain boundaries were redrawn. The old class hierarchy was formally abolished. A conscript army replaced the samurai military role. And between 1868 and 1876, the stipend system was progressively reduced and then eliminated, replaced with government bonds that many recipients had no experience managing and no reliable way to convert into stable income. For samurai who had already spent decades in debt, this was not a reform. It was a termination notice. Estimates suggest that at the end of the Tokugawa period, the samurai class comprised somewhere between 5 and 6% of Japan's total population, roughly 2 million people including family members. This was not a small elite. It was a substantial social stratum with its own culture, educational traditions, and economic expectations. What the Meiji reforms did in economic terms was execute a forced conversion of that class's primary asset, hereditary stipend claims, into a fixed-value financial instrument that paid out over time, but could not generate the kind of income or status the old system had implied. Many samurai attempted to use their bond payments to start businesses. The results were mixed. Some succeeded. Families with connections to the new government or existing commercial relationships adapted. But many lacked business experience, capital reserves, or the networks needed to compete in the emerging Meiji economy. A significant number sold their bonds outright, often at a discount, and found themselves with neither stipends nor capital within a few years. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 must be understood against this backdrop. Saigo Takamori, the the rebellion's leader and one of the most respected military figures of the Restoration period, was not simply fighting to preserve the sword. He was leading men who had been materially dispossessed, men whose entire framework of identity and livelihood had been dismantled within a decade. Satsuma, in southern Kyushu, had one of the highest concentrations of samurai in Japan. When the government abolished stipends and conscripted commoners into the national army, the grievance was both economic and existential. The rebellion lasted from January to September of 1877. The government deployed a large national conscript force. The samurai, despite fighting with considerable discipline and tactical skill, could not overcome the disparity in firepower and numbers. Saigo Takamori died at the final battle of Shiroyama. The rebellion was crushed. If this kind of analysis is valuable to you, history explained through economics, not just politics, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps this kind of work reach more people. Here is what this history actually reveals about economic power. It is not simply a product of status. It is a product of liquidity, access to credit, and the ability to operate within whatever monetary system happens to be dominant. The samurai had status. For a long time, they also had real power, administrative, military, and social. But their compensation structure was locked to rice in an economy that was increasingly liquid. That mismatch created a permanent vulnerability. And the merchants who lent to them understood something the samurai often did not, that a claim on future income is worth something today, and that interest compounds. The Tokugawa hierarchy said that merchants produced nothing of value. But merchants were doing something the samurai class never fully controlled. They were intermediating capital. They were turning illiquid assets, future rice harvests, social obligations, land rights, into present cash. That function gave them leverage that no military title could neutralize. This dynamic is not unique to Japan. In medieval Europe, noble families borrowed from Italian banking houses and gradually transferred wealth through interest. In the Ottoman Empire, the gap between formal military authority and actual financial control followed similar lines. In each case, the group with formal power and the group with liquid capital were not the same. And over time, that gap determined the outcome. What made Japan's case distinct was the speed of the disruption. Perry's arrival in 1853 compressed into 2 decades a transition that might otherwise have taken another generation. Economic systems rarely announce their own obsolescence. The samurai living in Edo in 1750, borrowing from merchants to pay for a ceremonial kimono or a household servant, was not thinking about structural transformation. He was thinking about maintaining his reputation, paying his debts, and managing his household. The system he inhabited still functioned, imperfectly but recognizably. The signs were visible to anyone looking carefully. Domain finances were a matter of administrative record. The growth of merchant wealth was documented in Osaka trade records going back to the 17th century. The gap between samurai stipends and urban costs of living was a known and frequently discussed problem within Tokugawa administration. Reformers within the shogunate understood that Japan's economic position was increasingly precarious. But understanding a structural problem and resolving it are different tasks. The Tokugawa system had its own internal logic, its own constituencies, and its own mechanisms for resisting change. The samurai did not lose their wealth because they were poor warriors or poor administrators. They lost it because the economic system they depended on was not designed to survive a transition to a cash economy, and because the transition came faster and harder than anyone inside the system had the power to prevent. What happened in Japan between the mid-1600s and 1877 is a precise historical case study in how a dominant class can be economically undone, not by conquest, but by structure, by the slow arithmetic of debt and interest, by the gap between how a system is supposed to work and how it actually moves money. The sword is a powerful image. But the real battle had already been decided long before Shiroyama, in the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of debt, and in the ledgers of the merchants who held it. If this kind of historical analysis matters to you, subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and like the video. The conversation continues in the next one.